Hello, I'm Nikki Marmery. I'm the author of On Wilder Seas, which is the story of the only woman on the Golden Hind during Francis Drake's circumnavigation voyage.
Brought to you by the Wilbur and Niso Smith Foundation, the Adventure Society is a book club for adventurous people. In each episode, we try to bridge the gap between an author and their readers. In this episode, we talk to Nikki Marmery, author of On Wilder Seas.
I used to be a journalist. I used to be a financial journalist, and I used to edit quite niche publications about financial markets, trading markets like credit and foreign exchange. And in the 2007-2008 financial crisis, that coincided with the first of my 3 maternity leaves, which put an end to that career. And I found myself at a point where I was thinking about what to do next. And I had always wanted to write a book, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity, really. So I signed up with the Faber Academy and did some courses there. And so while I was at home, I had over the next few years, I had 3 children. So I was learning how to write fiction, also following this project that I'd got myself embroiled in. And it was a very, very slow journey because I was also at home with 3 children, but that's how it started.
How long do you think it took you to write the book?
Well, I know exactly when I had the idea for it because I was pregnant with my 3rd child. So he's now 7. So I know how long it's taken. But as I say, a large part of that time was doing other things, learning how to write creatively, because it's very different to writing journalism, sort of having to retrain my brain into writing and thinking in a completely different way. And the research was huge for this project, absolutely huge. You know, I'd say 95% at that time was the research, not the writing. So yes, 7 years it took, all in all.
How did you get On Wilder Seas published?
As I was writing, actually, it didn't even start off as a book. It started off as an obsession, really. I wanted to find out about this woman that I had read about, and nothing was written about her. So the only way to learn about her was to do the research myself. So it started off more as a sort of research project, or sort of an obsession, if you will. And then it sort of gradually developed. As I learned more, I realised it was turning into a book. But still, I don't think I ever expected it to get published eventually. But towards the end, I started entering competitions. I entered the Myriad Edition's first drafts competition before I'd finished the book, and I was shortlisted for that award, which was incredibly motivating, and it sort of inspired me to think, actually, this could be a book, and I'm going to finish it. And then after that, I got shortlisted for another prize, the Historical Novel Society's first novel award, and that really, you know, that sort of made me think, okay, I can do this now. So that's what sort of spurred me on for the last part. And then, of course, once you have finished, you sort of think, with your first book, you finish it, and it's such a great achievement. You know, you doubted this moment for so many years, and then you reach it, and then you realise you've got to start again, because you've got to get an agent, you've got to get a publisher, and that can almost take as long, you know, and you have to have a very thick skin, because there is a lot of knockbacks. And so that sort of period after finishing the novel, it took me about 3 months to get an agent, and then thereafter almost a year to get the book deal. So it was a very, very long and sometimes painful journey. So in that process, when you're seeking an agent, you get feedback from people. Some people like the book, but they don't like the characters. Some people like the writing, but they don't like the story. And so you're sort of bombarded with this feedback. And so it's really something when someone comes back and says, I really like this book, you know, I like everything about it. That's really overwhelming. And so when someone says that to you, you know, you're like, you know, please represent me.
Absolutely. Were you ever tempted to change anything about the book based on the feedback you received?
Yes, in fact, I did change quite a lot. And I think feedback comes in 2 forms. You know, you get some feedback that you sort of immediately think, well, I don't agree with that. That's not what I'm trying to do. And that's fine, because people will have different reactions to your book. And then sometimes you'll get feedback, and initially you'll think, no, I don't agree, but you might think it over and then think, actually, there is something there. And when you're submitting a book for publication, you know, you're getting feedback from people at the top of the industry, and so you should listen, and you should be open to what they've got to say. But I think you have to work out first whether you agree with it, and if you agree with it, then I think it's really important to go away and make those changes, because they know what they're talking about. And you know, the changes that I did make to the book after sort of the first time I thought I'd finished it are some of them are quite major changes, and they have definitely improved the book. So I think you have to be really open and sort of shut down that initial response to say, no, I'm not going to change that. This is my baby. I think you have to shut that down and think about it for a while before you sort of decide what you're going to do.
Do you think being a journalist helped you transition into being a novelist?
The actual writing is very, very different. And in fact, sort of a large part of my journey was sort of having to relearn writing. You know, in journalism, you're writing for clarity. And sometimes if you're writing opinion pieces, you're writing to convince. And, you know, that's very different to writing a novel, where you have to be thinking about characters' motivations and the arc of, you know, their narrative arc and things like that. So it is, yes, some things are helpful. And I think that sort of training in editing is actually more important than the writing. You know, as an editor in journalism, you're constantly trying to sort of make everything clearer, and that usually means shortening. That usually means cutting things out of sentences, and that's very useful when you're writing a novel, because what you end up with when you write your first draft, it is instantly improved by cutting out 25% of it, and that's the same sort of as journalism really. Everything is improved by being shortened and squashed into something more easier to understand. It's the story of Maria, and she is a real historical figure. She was aboard a Spanish merchant ship in April 1579, sailing south from Acapulco. And at this point, she's an African woman. She was most likely enslaved at this point. And as she was sailing south, Francis Drake happened to be sailing north on his circumnavigation attempt. And as he sort of sailed up the Pacific coast of America, he would raid ships, raid ports, take whatever he fancied, you know, food, treasure, everything. And on this particular occasion, he took this woman, Maria, and she stayed aboard for 8 months. She was there when Drake sailed north to search for the Northwest Passage above America. And she was there when they lived ashore at Drake's colony, which is called Nova Albion, which is somewhere in North America. And then she was aboard for the Pacific crossing. But after Pacific crossing, she was abandoned on a desert island, waterless desert island in Indonesia, at which point she was very heavily pregnant.
Where and when did the idea for On Wilder Seas first appear?
I was reading a social history book which mentions Drake's voyage, and she was mentioned in a very throwaway kind of way, sort of a one sentence. Her name wasn't even mentioned, even though we do know Maria's name. And it just struck me, the sort of bare facts of her story was so difficult to read, and I wanted to know more. But there is no more information to find out about her. We know the facts, we know the dates she joined the Golden Hind, we know the dates she left the Golden Hind, and that's pretty much it. So in order to sort of fill in those gaps, I had to go away and do more research into the possibilities of Maria's life.
And how did you do your research for this novel?
Well, I wanted to, I studied history at university. I wanted to research from primary sources. That was very important to me. And so I'm very lucky to have, I live near London, so I can get to the British Library. So I was very lucky to have access to just amazing accounts of not only Drake's voyage, but similar voyages in this era. And so, I started with the Journal of Drake's Voyage, which was written by Francis Fletcher, who was the chaplain on board his ship, and who appears as character in my book, those are wonderful diaries with his pictures of the things they've seen, the flora and the fauna. And then I moved on to there are other wonderful accounts. There's an account written by another chaplain on another ship called Richard Maddox, who was on a similar voyage to Drake a few years later, in fact, with many of the same people on board. And he's written another journal. And from him, in fact, I sort of took the idea of Fletcher in my novel writing in cipher, because he had real problems with the people he was on board the ship with. You're trapped on this ship with these sometimes quite unpleasant characters. And so he used to write in cipher to sort of bitch about them, really. And they all had nicknames. So I sort of took that idea for Fletcher. But there are so many accounts, that we have the horrific eyewitness accounts of John Hawkins' slaving voyages, which it sort of appears as the backstory in my book. And Hawkins was Drake's cousin. Drake had sailed with him on at least one of these voyages. And we have his own eyewitness accounts of this horrific massacre in Sierra Leone, from which they took people and trafficked them across to America. We have several eyewitnesses accounts of that voyage, which are very painful to read. But when you read sort of first-person accounts like this, it really helps to build a picture of what it is you're writing about, and you feel a real connection to the story. So that was my method, really. But then another sort of difficulty of this book is that I'm writing about places 500 years ago and cultures from 500 years ago where we do not have written records. So for those parts of the book, I read a lot of folklore and mythology. because I think you can learn a lot about a culture by learning about their mythology, what's important to them, what values are important, what morals, what's considered moral and what isn't. So, there was a lot of that as well. So there were a lot of different sources and a lot of sort of layering on of these details, but it was a very, very challenging job.
I would love to talk about your central character, Maria. How would you describe Maria?
Well, she is, above all, she's resilient. She's had terrible injustices done to her throughout her life, and yet she picks herself up and she keeps going. She is incredibly resilient. She's very courageous, but that's not without an awareness of the situation she's in and the vulnerabilities that she has. And she is someone who is constantly sort of risk assessing, really. In every new environment she's in, she has to sort of scan the room, really. Where are the dark places where people can hide and jump out at me? What are the risks here? What can I do? What can I do about them? What can't I do? And at the beginning of the book, she's very accepting of this awful situation that she's in. But her journey, really, throughout the book is to stop accepting that situation and to resist it and to fight back. And so by the end of the book, hopefully you see that she has sort of acquired all she needs throughout the course of this journey to fight back.
But even knowing what life was like at the time, how did it feel as a writer to give your central character such a difficult life?
It was really hard, and it was particularly hard because it was based on real stories, because it was based on primary sources of real people. It was very hard to write, and a lot of the details of slavery were taken from sort of very early book in the 17th century, published in 1627, called A Treatise on Slavery, which was written by a Jesuit priest, and in it he documents the horrors of slavery in colonial America at this time. And so a lot of those details are from real stories, such as when the slave ships would arrive in Veracruz, the friars would come sort of pouring out to the port, not because they wanted to help these people sort of being brought out of the slave holds in pitiful conditions, but because they wanted to baptize them. They wanted to save their souls. And another detail that came from that book was, as when Maria is in Africa and she's watching a progression of Portuguese slavers leading some people, to the coast. And she sees as people fall, because they can't, they've been marching for sometimes weeks, they would chop a hand off and put it in a basket, and that was their way of counting how many people had died on the journey. You know, these details of inhumanity that ended up in the book happened to real people. So that's really hard to read. Throughout the course of writing this book, you know, I started because I had this sort of quite visceral reaction to Maria's story, but I think by the end of it, it was worse. You know, I felt very protective towards her and horrified on her behalf, and you know, it was a you know, by the end of the book, I found it even more difficult than at the beginning, to be honest.
Throughout history, women are left out of the records fairly often, and you were inspired to tell Maria's story, but how did you fill in the gaps?
So I wanted to seek out narratives where women in similar situations to Maria were able to describe their own lives. And you might think that's sort of quite hard to find, you know, we're talking about the 16th century, we're talking about women who may be enslaved or from a history of slavery. But in fact, because of the Spanish Inquisition and because of the sort of detailed legal records the Spanish kept, there's actually a huge amount of information out there, because these, you know, when they encountered sort of legal situations like this, the people's words were recorded. They were transcribed in their own words. So you can see a lot more of the personalities behind the people who are talking. So I found a wonderful book of primary sources called Afro-Latino Voices, which has these incredible accounts of women being very active, being very courageous, and having agency in their own lives. You know, women who were fighting witchcraft accusations and won. You know, that's amazing to read. You know, it's an enslaved woman in colonial Mexico, sort of, you know, fighting back and winning. So good to read. You know, women who petition the crown for permission to travel. You know, women who are sort of, you know, fighting, using their knowledge of the system to sort of achieve their own ends. And that's really what I wanted for Maria. You know, I was also inspired by reading about this great empress called Mansarico, who was this African warrior queen. And she had led her people out of Mali and to what eventually became Sierra Leone and Liberia, so 100 years or so before Maria was born. And I wanted her to have that link to her, so that she had someone to look back on and be sort of inspired by, and to identify with, you know, these very strong women. So yes, all of these real life stories of real life women, you know, that some in many ways are unexpected, really inspired me. And it was their voices that really, that's when Maria came alive for me, actually, is when I sort of saw her in this very different mold, you know, a very active, bold, courageous woman who was changing the course of her own life using, you know, the quite limited resources she has to hand, you know, mostly her intelligence and her mind, but they're based on real women.
So without giving too much away, there is a big storm in the latter half of the novel, which I felt captured the terrifying idea of being caught in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with no land in sight, on a sailing ship, while this storm is raging. Do you have any tips for writing this kind of action?
Well, I think one of the sort of inspirations for that bit of the book actually was from something I have experienced. I was on a sort of quite a creaky old boat in Indonesia that got sort of stuck in a storm, and the engines cut out, and we were completely sort of at the mercy of what was thrown at us. And so that was sort of where I took inspiration. I sort of layered that on, you know, I've been on the Golden Hind replica, you know, it's tiny, and it's terrifying when you're in dock, you know, let alone out on the open seas. And it was sort of putting all those things together. You know, I've read sailors' accounts of being in storms, and, you know, especially accounts of Spanish sailors, because, you know, at this time the Manila galleons were going backwards and forwards between Acapulco and Manila, and quite often they went down. And so we have, you know, these descriptions of these sailors in absolutely terrifying circumstances. So I put all those things together. I think it's key to put yourself in unusual situations in life, because as a writer, all of this will feed through to what you end up writing. And when I was, terrified in the middle of the sea in Indonesia, genuinely not knowing whether we would survive, it was absolutely terrifying. That felt like the worst experience of my life, and it was at the time. But unusual situations sort of feed into your writing. So I would say, sort of put yourself in not dangerous situations, not like that, but unusual situations. Sort of help you sort of understand other experiences that you're hopefully never likely to have.
Would you call this an adventure story yourself?
Yes, absolutely. And that's how I'd always conceived it. Actually, it is about one of the most famous voyages of adventure and exploration, in British history. And there's two things going on. You've got the sort of the voyage of the Golden Hind in all its sort of dangers and wonders and the things that they see, and the immense, terrifying situations they find themselves in. But also you have Maria's journey, and as she is on this voyage, she's also going on a sort of an inner journey as well, to sort of reconnect with herself and to and she like the Golden Hind is going into the unknown. She wants to go, she wants to escape from the life that she has, and she's looking forward to a new life, she hopes, which will be completely different. She doesn't know where it's going to be or what it would look like, but she knows she needs to get there. So there's those two things going on. And I also wanted to completely turn around that sort of the idea of adventure story. The Golden Hind is a real boy's own adventure, and I wanted to turn it around and look at it through the eyes of a woman for once. Wanted to see what this looks like, from a woman's point of view, because they're very rarely, there aren't many stories like that. Story of adventure on the high seas, told by a woman. So I was sort of quite conscious that I was sort of doing that, turning it on its head.
Are there any particular books or authors which have made a lasting impact on you?
I love historical fiction, and I'm very much drawn to historical fiction. And I think, the work of Hilary Mantel, something that I really sort of was very affected by, and they're very inward looking, they're very inward looking stories of, you very much feel like you're in Thomas Cromwell's mind when you read those books. And I, hugely affected by her writing, because I think it's wonderful. And I also, while I was writing this book, I didn't read books about slavery, because I didn't want to mimic or sort of be led by them. And so when I finished it, I then went back to all these books that had been published while I was writing it that I really wanted to read. And there were two that really had a huge effect on me. Washington Black by S.E. Edugyan and The Underground Railroad. And both of those stories are sort of similar. Hesitate to put my book in the same category as these award-winning, wonderful books. But, they're stories of people who are escaping slavery, but going on incredible adventures to do so. And Washington Black in particular had a real effect on me. It takes you to some very unexpected places. And it's a wonderful book. I think I would say to read as much as you can, especially outside of the genre that you usually read, and to get in the practice of writing. And it doesn't matter what you write, but just sort of the habit of writing every day is really useful. It sort of, hones those muscles. And I think something that I've only learned recently, because I've had to learn through lockdown, is to write as early as you can in the day. Because that's, for me at the moment, that's the only time I can write. I have to I pick my laptop up as soon as I wake up, and I write before the children wake up, because the rest of the day forget it. But it's actually incredibly helpful, because when you do that, even if you only get 45 minutes or whatever it is, you have started that conversation with yourself, and it's lodged up there in your brain, and for the rest of the day, while you're sort of getting on with whatever else you need to do, and you're frustrated because you can't get to your project, but your mind is still turning it over, and it's solving problems. Your subconscious is at work without you even realizing. And when you come back to it the next day, you find sometimes that you have solved this very difficult plot point, or you've had an idea to make this scene more realistic and more involving. So I think that's something that's really useful. I wish I had learnt earlier.